This is 90.1 KZSU. Hello, welcome back to Modern Education. I'm your host, Ben Woodford. In the studio today, I have Ari Kelman. Ari is an associate professor at Stanford University. He's the Jim Joseph Chair in Education and Jewish Studies, a member of the Center for Jewish Studies, and associate professor of Religious Studies by courtesy. Ari is currently completing a book that explores the culture of contemporary evangelical worship music. The book examines how songwriters, worship leaders, and music industry professionals understand the role of songs as both vehicles for and practices of faith and identity. He's also writing a collection of essays entitled Learning to be Jewish that take case study approaches to questions about how people learn to be Jewish. So I'm going to bring Ari on the mic here, and we're going to get the interview started. Ari, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining me today in the studio. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So before we get into your book and your research and the things that you're doing around here, I'd just like to know, as an academic at Stanford, which is this very prestigious position, I'm assuming you weren't always a professor at Stanford when you were, the day you were born, you probably did other things. Yeah. So how did you get here? How did all of this happen?
It was a series of really fortunate accidents and a lot of hard work along the way. I went to college at UC Santa Cruz. I went to Berkeley High School.
Okay.
Which is probably my most formative educational experience.
Yeah.
Big public high school in Berkeley, California. And then I went to UC Santa Cruz. I took a gap year in the middle there and went to Santa Cruz. Also hugely formative. Santa Cruz was for me at the time this amazing place. We didn't have grades, which also for me left me with this real orientation toward classwork that focused on learning, not on grades. And I realized that's
a weird concept.
I know, isn't it? Isn't it? So we would get these long narrative evaluations and from each professor, each section lead or whatever. And I remember I went abroad my junior year, and I was in a class with a kid, and I got an 89 on a test, and I was like, cool, like that's pretty good. And the kid sitting next to me was like, well, aren't you going to go like haggle for the extra point because it's the difference between a B plus and A minus? And I was like, I don't really care. That's not a difference that really matters to me. Like, it doesn't mean that I sort of got more. And maybe I was just a nerd. about the whole thing.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that if that's the case, but I think you also had some socialization into a healthy way of looking at your education.
I think so. I like to think so. So I went to UC Santa Cruz and discovered that I really liked being in school, and discovered at some point, I majored in sociology, a very unusual sociology department there. I also fell in with what is called the History of Consciousness program.
Okay.
Down there. That's the only one of its kind. But it is as advertised. And it had this incredible cluster of faculty, sort of people who were involved in cultural studies, who were involved in literary criticism and pretty high theory, what I thought was high theory at the time. And I was like, I want to keep learning. What should I do? And so they said, go to grad school. So I ended up in the American Studies program at New York University. And
it's a big jump.
Santa Cruz to New York?
Yeah.
I mean, Santa Cruz is freaky in its way, so nobody really cares what you do. And then New York is like so big and anonymous that nobody really cares what you do. So there's a little through thread there. But when I was an undergrad, I discovered that you could study popular music and popular culture and get paid. Like, this seemed like a good thing to me. So I went to NYU with the intention of doing that. And really studied popular, like sort of dove into popular culture there, and ended up writing my dissertation about Yiddish language radio, as it happens, a history of Yiddish language radio in the United States, which was in the 1940s popular culture among a very small group of Americans.
Sure.
But nevertheless, and then I got a job at UC Davis in their American Studies program teaching about sound and music, which is what I was working on at the time. And I had developed a sort of side gig. So studying Yiddish radio, I was studying American Jews. Mm-hmm. And I developed a little bit of side work doing kind of contemporary studies of American Jews. And it was that work, I think, that was brought to the attention of the search committee that formed around this position. So the position was created, that I now hold, in 2010, mm-hmm. I think, if my timing's right. And then I joined the faculty to take the position in 2012, and it was really great because I loved my job at UC Davis. I had no, I had no issues with it really.
Right.
And so I got to come and say, look, this is how I approach concepts of, this is how I think about learning. This is how I think about religion. This is how I think about how communities form around cultural practices. And if this is the kind of thing that jives with the GSE, then I might be your person. And if not, I'll go back to Davis. I'll be fine.
That's a good spot to be in as far as job hunting.
Super fortunate. Fortunate. And fortunately for me, I think, what I had to say resonated with them. And I've been here. This is my 7th year.
Wow. That's a great story. Almost every time I ask this question, it is a similar story about the unusual or unpredictable or maybe even just completely lucky set of circumstances that lead someone to get where they're at. And to me, that always really resonates because it really speaks to, like, we weren't destined for something. We weren't necessarily always the best person for the job, even if we're very good at it.
Right.
The circumstances unfold and we end up where we're at. And sometimes it's very lucky or unlucky depending on who we are, but we didn't always earn it. A homeless person on the street didn't always earn being there.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing on both sides of the sort of socioeconomic scale.
Yeah. I mean, for me anyway, it was a lot of hard work to be put in positions where I could get lucky and where the timing worked out, right?
Exactly.
Had it been 2 years later or 3 years earlier, or had this other thing happened, or had I not done this and that thing to be in that position, I would be in a very different place today, and you'd be talking to somebody else in the booth probably.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's very, the academic job market is probably more capricious than even other job markets, but employment, where you live, those kinds of things are also so beyond, we plan a lot.
Right.
To make sure that we can handle it when stuff happens, but then stuff happens that you never planned for.
Exactly. And I love you also brought up the point about the hard work you did to put yourself in that position. It's always preparation meeting opportunity. Yeah. You can't have one without the other. If you weren't prepared, the opportunity comes, it'll always pass you by. Right. So that's a beautiful piece of it. Thank you for pointing that out. Tell us about your new book.
So I have a book. When you read my bio, it said that I was finishing a book, and the book is out, actually, which is great.
Oh, great, yeah.
It came out, and I need to update my bio.
I think so, yeah.
I was so busy writing my book, I couldn't update the bio. So the book came out in June. It's called Shout to the Lord.
Okay.
Making Worship Music in Contemporary Evangelical America. And it came out at NYU Press. And I'm looking at the people who are responsible for making worship music, so making the kind of music that primarily white evangelical churches use to pray with when they pray in a congregational setting.
So the kind of stuff you hear on, say, Christian radio, maybe?
Yeah. So there's some crossover. Christian radio, this is like one of these fine points that I deal with in the book, but Christian radio plays all kinds of Christian music. Mm-hmm. It plays what I would call kind of Christian rock or heavy metal or whatever. It plays all musical genres, as long as the lyrics are consistent.
Sure.
Worship music is music that's written specifically for congregational worship. Some of it is also played on the radio, and some of Christian rock is also sung in church. But this is like a subgenre. I consider it a subgenre of Christian rock,
like because indie rock being under regular rock.
Yeah, exactly. Because like there's a lot of Christian rock that is heavy metal or whatever, but and so it's not suitable really for singing on a Sunday morning.
Right.
So this is the stuff that's written specifically for praying with.
And what got you interested in this topic or going deep enough to write a book about it?
Yeah, it's a weird thing that a professor of Jewish studies is writing a book about evangelical
I don't think it's weird. I mean, it makes perfect sense in the religious studies sense, right?
So I was writing a book about synagogues, about Jewish congregations, like a decade ago, maybe a little bit longer, and I would go to these, and I was studying popular music, right? That was my first kind of scholarly and personal love. And I would go to these congregations and I would always ask, where should I see, if I wanted to see your community kind of at its best, what should I see? And a lot of times they said, just come to regular weekend worship, like just come to Saturday morning services and you'll see like what a wonderful community is. And I would go as part of my ethnography. And almost every time they were like singing the same songs that I sang as a kid growing up in synagogue, the same melodies, slower. Or they would do these kind of, sometimes they would do these like, we have a really great band, so they'd have a band, but they would be kind of over amplified and it'd be kind of wacky. Or there'd be like 4 guitar players,
Everybody needs a chance to play.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And a hand drummer and then somebody else who's leading, who's not in sync. And it got me thinking like, and I've been to a lot of shows, a lot of rock shows, and knew how great that could feel when it was really firing on all cylinders. And I was like, well, who's talking about that in this context? Because it's clear that these places that I was studying were not living up to what I had expected anyway, even if the congregation was totally fine with it.
Right.
And so my first thought was like, okay, U2, right? But it's really hard to get access to U2, as you might imagine. So
I call them once a week. They never call me back. Yeah.
I know. So rude, because they seem so nice all the time. So I was like, U2, right? And then I started looking around, and it turns out actually the people who are asking, who were at the time, and I think still are, asking some of the most kind of sensitive, nuanced questions about how to harness what is ostensibly the power of popular music for spiritual practice were evangelical Christians. And so I went to church a couple times. I'd never been before, just to check it out, and started going and started going to church, started meeting people, started going to conferences of worship leaders or songwriters. And just kind of met people, and one thing led to another. But that line of inquiry about how do you make that stuff that makes people do what they do, carried through. And so that's what the book is about. Okay.
And it makes perfect sense now, kind of knowing your background a little bit and this deep interest in music and in religion and religious studies. I mean, why not, right? It actually makes perfect sense. You put it all in context like that, right? So, okay. Well, that's really cool. And what do you think, your average person picking up this book, if they were interested enough, maybe after hearing this interview, what do you think they would get out of it?
I hope they would get out of it the sense that the process of making what is ostensibly a spiritual experience or a sacred experience is a deeply, deeply human one. That's really one of the core threads of the book, is how much consideration. You imagine that prayer is just kind of this like free-flowing, unmediated almost, expression. But it's really hard for, say, me to write a song that I think is going to be appropriate for you to sing as your prayer, right? I'm putting words in your mouth. In a certain way, so I want to be very careful about that. But it means that as I'm writing that, as I'm crafting, doing the craft work of songwriting, I'm thinking a lot about who you are, or who you as a congregation is, right? Who are 3,000 people, and what does this congregation need or want, and how can I kind of give them the tools to do this thing called prayer, which is a very strange ritual, even for people who are ostensibly practiced at it. And it's this very sensitive, very social negotiation that goes on. And so that's, I think, one of the main parts of the book, is that making sacred experiences actually deeply, deeply social.
Okay, and do you feel that your findings have shown that is really working well, or have these tools been incorporated in ways that are truly representative of what we know about music and engagement? And
I'm not sure, because like in the book, Joni Mitchell shows up. In the songwriter chapter. I mean, Bob Dylan shows up, the Beatles show up, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, average day for an academic, right?
Tin Pan Alley's in there. And like when I think about Joni Mitchell, I think about Bob Dylan, he wasn't writing songs for other people to sing, and she wasn't writing songs for other people. Joni Mitchell songs are Joni Mitchell songs. And if you're singing a Joni Mitchell song, you are singing her song. And you may do a great cover version of that song, but you're still singing Joni Mitchell's song at the end of the day, especially if it's from one like Blue, right? But worship songs are, I heard more than one person say to me, like, worship songs are sung best when they can be sung by anybody. They're kind of generic. And I did find that to be true. And I think that's a big difference between, like, studies of pop music, which often focus on the songwriter or the performer, right? Elvis, you know, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, whoever. And this kind of music, which is really written to be sung by... It's like the best campfire music. That's not so fair to the music, but it's like songs that really can be sung by anybody and become their songs. Accessible for a large cross-section, so to speak, yeah. And it has to be words that resonate, and the melodies also have to be able... Grandma has to sing it, you know, Johnny, who's 5, has to be able to sing it, Mom and Dad have to sing it. They all have to kind of enjoy singing it, or they're not going to like it. So it's actually this very complicated negotiation of all these constraints that go into the production of this particular genre. Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, because... when you're releasing a song that you hope will become popular music, you're always segmenting out a certain class or type of people that will be listening to that type of music. And you don't expect everyone to like it. It's not even the goal. Right. And yet when you're going into this, you know, church on Sunday morning kind of crowd, you have, you know, grandparents down to 5-year-olds and everyone in between. And so there's a much different dynamic of what you're trying to achieve with that. Yeah, it's a different... And they also say, like, you know, the style... Most of the songwriters I talked to said, you know, style is agnostic. We're agnostic about style. Kind of any... It happens to be that I write in this, you know, in sort of this pop wheelhouse, but the fact that people a generation ago were not writing songs like this, and people a generation from now are not going to write songs that sound like this, is fine. They were kind of very, utilitarian about the style of music, as opposed to in pop music where people get very kind of possessive or kind of boundary. There's a lot of boundary work that goes on. Well, that's not exactly jazz, right? That's too much like funk or too much like hip hop, and so they're very much like, I write in this mode because that's my mode, but it's just my mode. It's kind of idiosyncratic. Yeah, interesting. I'm curious. Are you a musician yourself? I play a little bit of music. I have in my past played more music. Okay. But I have 2 small children who I love dearly, but it means that I don't have time for much of anything. But I have a stand-up bass in my bedroom. Okay. I'm sure your wife is really glad that it's taking up all that room in your bedroom. Yeah, exactly. When it starts paying rent, we'll see. Okay. Well, let me know if that comes up. If your wife is listening, he's sorry. Okay, so we talked about your book a little bit, which I think if people are interested, they can go check it out, and it's out now, so that's a possibility. It's available on Amazon. Excellent. And so let's talk a little bit about just education, right? You're an education, or at least working in a school of education, and by courtesy education professor. Is that how that works? No, I'm in the School of Education. Okay. My whole life is in the School of Education. I'm by courtesy religious studies, actually. Okay. Backwards. Gotcha. So how do you see the difference between people learning about religion and people learning, say, in formal education settings? So one of the things that comes out in the book that honestly I don't think would have been in the book had I not been here was how these songs are educational tools. They teach people how to worship. If you go to church, you learn how to do that thing called prayer, and they're examples of worship at the same time. And one of the things that I realized early on when I started thinking more critically about education was that in terms of religion and things like that, people learn a lot more. People go to religious school, you go to parochial school, you can go wherever, but people mostly learn about religion, good, bad, and otherwise, not from school, right? The things that turn people on about religion or the things that turn people off about religion typically don't happen in school. Can you give me an example? Well, William James, the philosopher, has this book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, in which he lays out the varieties of religious experience.
Go figure, right?
It's a heck of a title. None of them happen in school.
Okay.
And it's really like this. He says this person had a religious experience, and here's how they describe it. And this person had a religious experience, and how they describe it. Religious experiences typically don't happen in school. Pivotal moments in people's kind of spiritual development mostly also don't happen in school. School nails stuff down. Mm-hmm. And I mean supplementary school, I mean Sunday school, all the stuff that happens outside of compulsory American education.
Okay.
But a lot of time that doesn't happen in a learning environment specifically. Mm. And so when I start thinking about learning religion, where or how do people learn religion, how to learn to be religious or learn about religion, right? It's holidays, it's churches or synagogues, houses of worship, it's communal celebrations, and it's music, and it's those elements that I think really land so strongly. And that, for me, opens up all these interesting avenues of how to understand how people learn to hold deep commitments of any kind, religious or not, as they happen outside of school. And so the challenge is much harder because I don't know precisely where to go and find it if I'm looking for it.
Yeah.
If I'm just interested in schools, I'm like, all right, I got to go to schools to find it. But it means looking outside of schools.
Right. Now, I'm thinking about this, and you're talking about how the religious learning experience is largely outside of the formal religious setting, or maybe
formal religious educational setting.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And I'm thinking about this in terms of formal education. And do you think there's some things we can learn from that as far as making formal education have those epiphany moments more often in more natural settings? I mean,
without getting too in the weeds of like learning theory, but like, the constructivists would say that the most powerful learning comes from doing, right? From being part of that process of figuring something out, of making something, of finding your own solution to a problem, not from learning rote multiplication tables. They would say that learning rote multiplication tables is fine, but because it's abstracted from the context in which those multiplication tables are meaningful, you actually learn it better if you have to count eggs or do whatever.
Yeah.
So this is kind of that, right? You can learn catechism, you can learn Bible quotes, you can memorize huge swaths of sacred text, but it's that other part where the sacred texts connect to actual lived experience, or where religious ideas or experiences actually mesh with everyday life, that those things take root. So on that score, I think the religious education is like deeply, deeply in line with some of the contemporary theories of how people learn best.
I see. So it sounds more like people get set up in these formal religious learning experiences with the frameworks and the groundwork to be able to go into their lives and their experiences to have these epiphanies or these leaps in their faith and understanding. Does that sound about right?
I think so. I think that's how people imagine that it works.
Okay.
Right. If I equip you with kind of an understanding of a particular theological idea, and then you go out into the world and you go to a football game, then you will have that in the back of your head, and you will look at the football game and be like, this makes me think about this theological idea. And yes, that theological idea aligns with my perspective on the world. I'm not sure that it happens exactly that way, right? It's probably a little bit more discursive. It probably goes kind of back and forth a little bit.
Sure.
Where I go to church, school, and then I learn stuff, and then I go out to the world, and I see things, and then I bring that back to school, and then it goes back and forth. Just like probably my guess is that some combination of formal schooling and informal contextual learning like feed off each other.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. You have a lot of background in music and sociology. I mean, that was kind of the things that led you to where you're at now. How have those lenses shaped the way you see your professorship here in the School of Ed?
So, I mean, I think that popular music is, and this is completely my idea. It has no empirical validation, and I can't even construct a research project that I could prove it. So it's totally theory, and if you're listening, you can call in and argue with me. That'd be awesome. But I think that I think pop music is an incredibly underappreciated educational, socializing force in the United States and probably around the world.
Are you thinking how it brings us together in kind of a common understanding or language? Or
sometimes, but I think it's like, if you think about like the girl groups in the 1960s, they were incredibly kind of, they weren't didactic, but they were instructional about what it meant to be a young woman at that time.
Oh, sure,
right?
Yeah.
What it meant to be in relationship with other young women, what it meant to be in relationship with other young men, and kind of expectations about gender and performance and romance and relationships and love in particular, because so much of pop music is about love. So I think pop music probably has taught more Americans about love than their own parents have, right? And what it has taught them about love is a different story, I think. But sure. I just think that it's such a powerful educational force. And we don't think of it as educational. I think we just think of it as entertainment or maybe socialization,
right.
Possibly. But socialization obviously is part of the education conversation. So I think that it's so powerful. And so for me, it's this perfect analog to thinking about how people develop ways of thinking the world works. We can call them religious, but the ways that people absorb messages and engage with messages on both a kind of intellectual level, but also on a physical level, whether it's by dancing or kind of worship choreography, and on an emotional level also.
Yeah. So I'm trying to just make sense of this here. You're talking about music being, it sounds like the sort of common narratives of the time, and bringing together some of the stories and the, civil rights struggles or feminist struggles that are happening, and bringing those out into the forefront in a way that is palatable and maybe even enjoyable to people who maybe wouldn't interact with those ideas in other contexts.
In part. I mean, it's a way of getting a message out, right? So
right.
Nina Simone or Bob Dylan or Pete Seeger or, Jay-Z.
We got the whole range
Beyonce,
there.
right? Like they all get messages out to people who would not necessarily go seek out those messages, but who are confronted with them and then have to reckon with them in one way or another. That I think is so powerful. And then people do gather around those, particular musical figures or particular musical genres, socially. But I think much more than that, it's sort of the messages that are transmitted through that music that that people learn about race, class, gender, spirituality, nationalism.
Sure.
All the kind of key sociological categories.
For better or worse, they learn about it.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm wanting to kind of jump into this religious studies, right? You're professor of, am I saying it right? Professor of religious studies or study religion?
I'm a professor of education and Jewish studies. That's my title.
Okay,
That's probably the easiest thing.
So let's talk about your own faith for a minute. You grew up in a Jewish family, right? Correct. And you were exposed to that for your entire childhood, and now you study it.
That's right.
Now, do you feel that you needed to have that experience growing up to be able to study Judaism in a meaningful way?
I probably did, but I don't know that everybody needs to.
Okay.
But yeah, for me, it was formative. It was a huge part of my life growing up. We went to synagogue every Saturday. We observed the Sabbath more or less in the ways that my family did. We were very involved. Both my parents worked in the Jewish world. And my father was a rabbi. I won't beat around the bush, but growing up as a kid, he didn't have a congregation. He was an educator. And so being Jewish was like, that was what my family did. Is what
big part of your identity, right?
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And so for me, that gave me a kind of a particular insider's knowledge and understanding of that world. That is, it's a very small world ultimately, but it gave me an insider's knowledge and a real curiosity about how that world functioned and how it functioned alongside these other worlds that kind of looked the same but looked different. That continued to, eat at me a little while. And why did it seem cool in these ways, but really uncool in these ways? And why did that happen? And how do we get here? And why does this look like that? Kind of all those questions that never quite squared with me, that led me to where we are. So here's a perfect example, which you could see coming out in the Christian music book, is like, so we observe Sabbath every weekend. My parents love ritual. They do ritual really well, my family. but like we never really, and so most Jews pray in Hebrew.
Okay.
And I speak Hebrew pretty well, but the ritual Hebrew, we never really talked about God, even though God shows up in all over the place. So my parents didn't have like a deep spirituality was not part of our Jewishness so much.
Okay.
And God wasn't so much part of our Jewishness.
Can you differentiate the two, or help the listeners understand what the distinction you're making there is?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really, so we never talked, my folks and I and my family, to my recollection, never talked seriously about God and what God was and what God did in the world, if anything, or if God existed in the first place. It didn't really matter to us in that way, in the way that one imagines it would to a family that was fairly involved in a religious community.
Right.
So it's a little weird. It seems a little weird, I think, from the outside. From the inside, there's a phrase that people bandy about when they're talking about religion and spirituality. People say, I'm spiritual but not religious, right?
Oh, we hear that all the time. Yeah.
So my parents were like religious but not spiritual. They were traditional.
We don't hear that one nearly as often. Yeah.
Yeah. So my family we were religious, but we were not spiritual. So they liked, like I said, they liked tradition, they liked ritual, they liked all those things. They weren't anti-religious. I actually don't know anything about my parents' relationship to God. But we were deeply in this community. And so that apparent tension that to me was so natural growing up, that still is natural in some ways, nevertheless it appeared unusual, I think, to a lot of other people, I think led me to ask questions. Well, what does it mean to be religious? What does it mean to be spiritual? How important is God in this world, or is God important at all? Or how did God end up in these places? Those are kinds of questions that I think are really, that brought me to ask these questions in a professional capacity now.
Right. That's really interesting to think about, because you had this entire formative cultural immersion growing up, but it seems like you weren't given the firm understandings of the questions that you had, so you needed to find them for yourself.
Right.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I just knew I really liked pop music.
Oh, yeah. I think we've dealt with that. Yeah. So I am really curious about this from the standpoint of, growing up in this family. It sounds more like it was a cultural upbringing in a Jewish context more than a religious upbringing in a Jewish community. But correct me if I'm wrong here. That's just kind of what I'm hearing.
the weird, I don't even know how to parse those differences in that context. So it's hard to say.
The lines are blurred.
Right. My mom, when she would light candles every Friday night to start off the Sabbath, she says the blessing, and the blessing, God is in the blessing,
Right.
And when I was a kid, I certainly didn't know that there was there's culture, and then there's ethnicity, and then there's race, and then there's religion, and there's these different kinds of religion, and then there's secularism. Those was not vocabulary I had access to as a kid. I just knew we did what we did. Now that I'm looking back and I have access to that vocabulary and those concepts, I can apply them to elements. But there's a lot of murkiness between what is cultural and what is religious, what is ethnic and what is cultural and what is religious, and what is secular and what is religious. All those things are very the boundaries between them are extremely porous, and people like me spend a lot of time trying to parse them.
Yeah, and I guess better you than me, because I don't know. I don't even know what just happened. But okay, so I wanted to just jump a little bit around here, but I'm thinking about religion in the sense of being a moral compass, not just Judaism necessarily or Christianity, but religion as a concept. Do you think it is currently, or has ever been, a set of moral guiding principles? Is that the purpose?
I think some of them try to be. I think they all probably try to be in some form or fashion. Mm-hmm. I don't really know. It's so easy to look at, because to get at that, we'd have to understand what morals are.
Sure.
I think, and then we'd have to figure out which are which, right?
Right.
I think that seems to be, I would say, all of the things in the world that we call religion have that as a part of it, right? One should behave in this particular way.
Right.
And then they can differ about, how you should behave, right? Don't shave, do shave, whatever.
Sure.
But they all seem to have that as part of it. So I would say that from a kind of anthropological point of view, there's a very scholarly, removed kind of answer. But from an anthropological point of view, it seems to be there a lot in all these things that we call religion. So,
right.
So therefore, Ben, you're probably right that it is.
Huh.
But it's so easy to look at religion nowadays.
Yeah.
I mean, politics and so on, and just say like, oh my God, everybody's corrupt.
Right. Well, so I think what you're
pointing there.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing out maybe is people using religion as more of a political or social tool rather than maybe the pure form of it.
Right. But it's kind of always been that way.
Right.
I mean, once something becomes social, it becomes political.
Sure.
In a certain way.
Sure,
so there's no way to trace back how far one could go till you get to that pure religious sensibility.
Sure. And maybe there never was a pure instance of, Judaism, for instance.
Right. Like when did that come into being, and was it ever apolitical? And if you read the Bible as history, which you could, I don't think it was ever non-political. Whatever politics meant in Canaan.
Sure.
Thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
It seems completely tied up with that. At least the Jewish story. And then, Christianity is the same, right? You end up, the Romans are there and the Jews are there, or the Israelites. And you then have this, it's really a political thing that's happening in the context of Judea of, circa year zero.
Yeah.
It's totally tied into religious power and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and who has power over these various rituals in the temple. And so it's kind of deeply enmeshed in these political differences.
Yeah, so there is no discerning the intertwining of the two. I mean,
I don't think so.
Religion is politics, and politics is religion in some way. They are deeply connected.
I'd say it's political.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is politics.
Okay, fair enough.
But I'd say it is political.
Yeah, absolutely. So, along those lines, does it seem to you like religion serves the purpose to bring people together, or to more keep us separate and clear on our differences, or more focused on differences?
Well,
and this is a very general question, so take it however you want to.
Well, it's hard to say something about religion because nobody has religion as a generic category. You always have some form of religion. Right?
Sure,
so you have, right, you're Hindu or you're Muslim or you're Sikh or whatever. And so nobody has, you can't just have religion. You have to have a version of it. And so if you have a version of it, then someone else has a different version of it. So automatically you get some differentiation that happens. It's almost impossible to imagine a kind of global religion, although people have in the past, right? They've imagined like everybody will be the same under my religious vision.
Well, that hasn't worked.
Right, exactly. Those things always seem to end badly.
Yeah.
So if there's division, then there's differences, and if there's differences, then you're not going to have a kind of global kumbaya moment, I think, with religion. Although various people imagine that they can do it, people on the left and people on the right.
Yeah.
I'll say we'll get together with our, typically it's kind of language of the religious left, like we'll get together with our interfaith brothers and sisters and we will fight X or we'll advocate for Y.
Right.
But I'm not sure, and they kind of do that under the umbrella of liberal religion. But I don't think that they ever say like, all right, now we're all going to be the same religion. Right.
Yeah. So sounds like what you're saying is the very nature of having different religions in general sort of creates a divide, whether or not people believe in brotherly love, however you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be this ideological difference as long as there are people with faith.
I think so. And there it's funny. So then you get this like class of mystics, right? Who are like, no, we are above the fray. we have a straight channel. But most religions have a kind of mystical tradition somewhere in there. And this is like a common kind of argument in religious studies, right? Are religions just the means and the end is this kind of mystical state? And we all have the same mystical state. Mm-hmm. We just have different ways of getting there. In which case we're all different, but we're all equal.
Okay.
Or do the different strands of religion, the different varieties, have their own versions of that mystical state? And therefore, we're not actually all after the same thing. We're all after different things that when we describe them, they seem the same, but they're actually different. And so the nature of religious difference, and I think because of the transcendent or because of the spiritual domain in which so many religions invest, it raises the stakes of that question quite a bit because it's about ultimate truth, right? It's not just about my flavor ice cream versus your flavor ice cream.
Right.
The stakes are high.
Yeah, absolutely. I seem to remember I think it came from the Quran. There was a statement in there about how we're all going towards the same God and we're just trying to get there in different ways. And maybe there's an analog in some of the other religions.
Religions that have been around that long, like they accumulate a lot of wisdom.
Right.
Some of which supports that and some of which goes against that.
Right.
So I mean, I don't study sacred texts actually because I'm a social scientist, so I study people. But I think if you look around the kind of library of sacred texts of any particular religious community, you're going to find some messages that you get down with and some messages that you don't, including whatever one you were raised in.
Sure, yeah. And that's almost how it works, right? Give enough messages and everybody can find something that fits their point of view. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I mean, this arrow goes by so quick. I actually really wanted to ask you because you are a resident faculty on campus.
Yeah, a resident fellow.
A resident fellow. Okay, wrong term, but RF. It was something with the RF, right? And you basically are sort of a den keeper or a father figure to a huge number of students that come almost cycling through. Is it every year you get new students?
Yep.
Tell me about that. That sounds like a crazy journey.
Did In Young put you up to this? Is this your question?
I have spoken with In Young. That's true.
Yeah. So when I started Stanford 6 years ago, we became resident fellows, my wife and I. At that time we had one child. Now I have two. And we live in a dorm with 99 first-year students and 7 upper-class students who are essentially resident staff.
Okay.
And we are, to say I'm a father figure is, I think, overstating. Our job is so weird. We run the gamut. So we are kind of mentors and we're kind of adults. We're adult figures, I would say, not parents exactly.
Okay.
And we absorb some of that, like some of the resistance and some of the affection reserved for adults.
Sure.
And we're like project managers and we're teachers and we're consultants and we're counselors. And we do all of those things mostly so that the residents who are in the hall, who are in the middle of this massive life transition, coming from wherever they coming to college, coming to Stanford, don't have to worry about all this. So we take care of a lot of stuff that I think the residents don't really recognize or appreciate. And it's not their job to. Like, they shouldn't. That's our job. We took that. That was what we signed up for.
Right.
But it's really interesting. And as somebody, again, who thinks about how people learn outside of school, to have the perspective, the very, very intimate perspective on undergraduate life. I mean, I eat in the dining hall with them. I see them on the hall. We talk.
Right.
And, to watch them live the college experience that has something to do with classes, but is not necessarily organized around classes, again, gives me this perspective on education generally and how it happens in how higher education happens, in which classes are not what you learn in class is not the main thing. And when I talk to them at the end of the year, I run into them when they become sophomores or juniors, and I say, like, what's the best part of your first year? They always say, my friends, like the relationships I made are the best part. Right? I've yet to have somebody be like, oh man, History 70A was amazing. Or
I wrote this paper that really is like my whole life. Right,
exactly. Maybe if we talked a little bit more, they would come down. But it's always those kinds of experiences that they get at school, but outside of class.
So you've been doing this for a long time.
Yes.
7 years, you said?
This is our 7th year.
Tell me, what is the most wholesome, like, enriching part of all of this?
The most wholesome, enriching part of it really is when I go to the dining hall and I see a table full of my residents from 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh, wow.
That's the best part.
Yeah.
Well, there's 2 best parts. That's the best part, is like seeing that we had a hand, however distant, in building really, really strong, really important relationships for these people at Stanford. The other part is staff. So we work really closely with the staff. And I love our staff from every year and keeping those relationships with the staff. So now we have former staff who are in grad school. We have former staff who are in med school. We have former staff who are like all of the United States. Some live close by, but some have like live far away.
Right.
But we, text every once in a while. We're like, keeping those relationships are really important to me. They're incredibly important people in our lives for a very intense year.
Right.
And being able to maintain those relationships and really see them grow, and they get to see us grow, and they visit our kids, they babysit, whatever. That to me is also the best.
Yeah. It sounds, I can just imagine going into the dining hall and seeing a group that you, in some way, helped connect years before, and they're still friends. And that to me, my heart is warm just thinking about it. Yeah. Now, we got to, of course, flip the coin here. What's the hardest part? What is the most gut-wrenching or the most really tear-jerking part? Because I'm sure there's plenty.
Yeah, the hardest part is probably, the students come with a variety of experiences. And the hardest part is when I see students sort of regularly not taking care of themselves in the way that I think they should. Mm-hmm. There's parts that are annoying, loud noises late at night and so on, but it's not
par for the course, right?
It's like I chose to live in a dorm.
Right. Freshman dorm, you got to expect some rules messing up.
Exactly. So the hardest thing is to watch students engage in self-destructive behaviors, hurting themselves, hurting their friends, and kind of knowing, being able to see, or students going through a really hard time, and me with a little bit of perspective, being able to see a way out or another option, and have them not really take advantage of the opportunities that they have to treat themselves or their friends a little bit better. And that's really hard to watch because there's nothing we can do. We can't stop them from doing things. And I don't mean if there's self-harm involved, obviously we have legal things, but just sort of not sleeping or drinking too much, like those kinds of things, where it's really hard to watch them do these things that are ultimately really having a negative effect on them and their friendships. But there's nothing we can do to stop them exactly.
Yeah, it's a feeling of, I'd imagine, a little bit of helplessness, right? Because you care and you want them to be successful.
Yeah. So we do that. It's also a little frustrating. Stanford is an unbelievable place in so many ways, and there's so many things to do. And we can bring in amazing people, and we can the opportunities to do things either for free or really inexpensive are all over the place. Meet incredible people that come to the campus, go on amazing trips, take these classes with roll around, professors. And a lot of times they'll make decisions like, I can't go do X because I have a meeting or I have to study. And part of me, it feels funny saying this as a professor who wants my students to do the reading. I'm like, but don't you understand? You can, do this amazing thing that doesn't happen all the time.
Right.
And I also have to let them, they have to make their own decisions, and they that meeting, whatever it is they have to go to, is really so important that they're not going to go hear a Grammy Award winning whatever. All right, it's cool. I'm not going to,
Yeah, that's
just frustrating. It's more frustrating than heartbreaking.
I think that's actually a really prevalent problem on this campus. I think there's a lot of people who maybe think that next class or that next paper is going to be the most important thing they have going on that week, and sort of miss. I mean, to me, I'm trying in spite of all the things that are constantly weighing. I'm always trying to realize the people that I meet here and the friendships that I cultivate are going to far outlast the 5 years I'm spending here earning a PhD.
Yeah. And hopefully you're doing your reading.
Sure. Yeah.
You're getting
at least 75% of it. Yeah.
But to say here's an opportunity to see an astonishingly accomplished person from whom I can not just get knowledge, but kind of wisdom or insight. Or here's an opportunity to do something that I never would otherwise be able to do. I just think is a huge part of what Stanford has to offer.
Yeah.
And it breaks my heart always a little bit when it's why? And I'm guilty of this as well. I live on campus and I don't do half the things I wish I could do.
Sure.
But it just breaks my heart that there's these great things out there that people don't kind of take advantage of.
Yeah. Now, having come from, I know UC Santa Cruz is still a pretty nice school, right? But it's definitely a different environment, different feel of the town, different sort of demographics and who's showing up to go to that school. Do you see there being a large difference between the student body or the priorities of student body, just in your own experience?
I just think that the difference in higher education now versus when I was a student, 25 years ago, are just so vast. I thought that my peers that went to schools like Stanford were like superhuman at the time. And then I meet these residents, and they're like, they always have like, they're great people and they have done really well in school, but then it's always like, oh, and by the way, I invented this thing, or oh yeah, in my spare time I have a nonprofit that helps XYZ, or oh yeah, while I was working as a model, I also had an NGO that did this thing. So they have this like incredible capacity to do a lot of things,
right?
And so that's like, those are the Stanford students. They can manage a lot of things, and they do them all well, mostly.
Yeah. And do you think Stanford's doing the right thing by only bringing, or trying to purposely bring, that type of student in?
I don't know if that's the right thing. I have to say.
Yeah.
That's what makes the elite institutions is they're elite.
Right.
But I as somebody who went to public school and then taught in a public institution before I came here, there are amazing students and amazing faculty at all of these schools.
All right.
I at Santa Cruz got really lucky, and one of the great things that I experienced at Santa Cruz, and I think some of my students at UC Davis experienced this too, is like, if you are interested and motivated, the faculty are there, and they're psyched when anybody comes to their office hours, because nobody comes to talk to us. We mostly just sit alone and work.
That sounds lonely.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's fine. It is lonely, but but at Santa Cruz, I could go talk to people who were incredibly influential to me, because they were there. And I was like just some punk undergrad, and I was like, hello, Mr. So-and-so, or Professor So-and-so, do you have time? And they did. And I gained a huge amount from that. And they were so generous to me. And all I was a curious student. It doesn't take more than that.
Right.
And then they got me into grad school, right? I have no doubt that those letters of recommendation is what did it. But I went to talk to them. It wasn't because I wanted a letter of recommendation. It's because I thought they knew things.
Right.
And my friend Ben was like, we should go to this thing. And I was like, oh, okay. I just didn't know any better.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, the faculty, pretty much anywhere you go, are going to be really good. And you can, anywhere you go, get a spectacularly good education. Right.
This is something I've been thinking about, and you just kind of brought it out in my own head about how it may be that some of the greatness of the students at Stanford could literally be instigated by them believing that they're great because they got into Stanford.
There's a little bit of that.
Yeah.
That also comes with being 18 and 19 and 20, 45, with a kind of undercurrent of like, oh, I'm the mistake. Everybody else who is here belongs here, and I'm the one that should not. We hear that from students, I mean, in various forms, with some regularity, like, oh, I'm the one who got in by accident. I don't belong here. So they're told by the university, you are the special 4% of people who get in.
Right.
And then, but they know themselves, and they're 18, so they're, or 19 or whatever, so they have insecurities, because everybody has insecurities, and they're like, oh, well, I know that they're saying this, but if they only knew X about me, they would know that I don't really belong here, or I only got in because of XYZ, I don't deserve to be here as much as this other person. And so there's a kind of back and forth between that, a sort of wrestling about identity and location and what it means to be where you're at.
This is the so-called impostor syndrome, right? The feeling of not quite being adequate to have earned this position. And I think this goes back to kind of where we started. Nobody ever really earns it. You can do as much as you can do all the preparation, and if the opportunity comes, you'll take it.
Right.
But the fact is, nobody earns it. Nobody deserves the highest position in society. They get there because of who they know and where they were at.
Right, or everybody earns it in one fashion or another.
Sure,
and,
that's another way you could
just
think
in the
about
right
it.
position, just sort of in the right place at the right time. Right. I mean, I have friends in grad school who are much smarter than I was, who are better writers than I was, who I thought did better work than I did, and they didn't get academic positions. And now they're doing other things, and they're happy and satisfied and stuff.
Sure.
I was like, oh, of course, that person is going to,
Right.
So it's just, there's just so much chance in the system.
And it's so easy to fall into that comparison trap and sort of miss the big picture that you're here now, and it's your chance, so take it.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of chances.
Absolutely. Ari, this has been a lot of fun, and I can't believe the hour is almost over already. We have a couple of songs that once the end of the show outro is going, we're going to play a couple songs to you.
Cool.
Have any comments on why you chose what you chose? We'll only get through one or two, so just kind of in general, you had a really nice swath of different types of music.
You sent me the question this morning. I was like, oh man, what would I like to hear? And it was just really off the top of my head.
Okay.
I probably have connections to all these songs, but nobody on earth wants to hear why I love certain songs at all. So
we'll just say goodbye then and let them listen, and they can make their own conclusions.
Right on. Enjoy.
Thank you so much for coming in. This was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. This is Ben Woodford with Modern Education.